This podcast may contain paid advertisements, but more on that later. Welcome to the O'Connor Bootstrap Podcast, where I discuss the nuts and bolts of business and leadership, with a focus on bootstrapping a business from the ground up. This podcast is for all entrepreneurs, bootstrappers, and leaders in all walks of life. My goal is to help you grow both personally and professionally. I am your host, Isaiah O'Connor. Hello, everyone. Isaiah here. Today, I'm just going to do an introduction to an interview I did earlier this year, or last year, I can't remember. Anyway, I got to interview John David Mann. And for the audio listeners, you might have heard this already, but so this is going to be a repost of that one, but I'm going to update the file to include this current introduction. Now, if you don't know who John David Mann is, he is the co-author of the book, The Go-Giver, with Bob Burg, and he's also an award-winning author who has sold over 3 million copies in 3 dozen languages of different books. He's written the New York Times bestselling memoir, The Red Circle, with former Navy SEAL Brandon Webb, a New York Times bestselling parable, The LATTE Factor, with personal finance legend David Bach. As a teenager, John started his own high school and was award-winning composer and cellist before turning to a career as an entrepreneur and author. His book, Take the Lead, with former White House staffer Betsy Myers, was named by Tom Peters and the Washington Post Best Leadership Book of 2011. His first novel, Still Fear, has been released as of July 13th. Amazing book. I highly recommend it. And he also had been called on that book lead child, and Jack Reacher of the Jack Reacher books has called it a sensationally good and instant classic, maybe an instant legend. You can go find out more, and he also has a free book about how to write over on johndavidmann.com. So without further ado, here we go into the interview with John David Mann. Thank you, John David Mann. Do you always go by John David Mann, or is it just John Mann, or
John is fine.
What do people
if
usually
I'm being
call you?
on people usually call me John. On book covers, it's John David Mann, just to differentiate from the other John Manns out there. But yeah, John is fine.
Yeah, it's like Winston Churchill. You know how he made most of his money?
I do not.
He was a writer.
Ah, yes.
A Nobel Prize winning writer.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently writing at the exact same time in America was another Winston Churchill.
Oh.
And he just said, I'm going to just put Winston Churchill America on my books.
Didn't work, probably.
Yeah. So no one heard of the other guy, though. So, of course, he didn't save the free world. So I guess there's that. Yeah. Anyway, welcome to my little podcast here. It's a podcast for businessmen, bootstrappers, entrepreneurs, leaders.
Yeah.
And the Go-Giver series is a perfect series for that. I've only read The Go-Giver, or listened to, I should say, The Go-Giver, where I've heard your voice and my mind just completely blanked.
Bob's. Yeah.
It's been a long day today. So I got up at 5 o'clock this morning to go to work for a little bit. Then I had a meeting at 12. And then I wound up getting a surprise job interview right after that. Because I need to make some cash there, since, as I discussed with you earlier, and for anyone who hasn't heard lately, COVID's been a little bit rough on the balloon and entertainment industry. So finding another job. So a little bit tired, so do bear with my rambling on today. But I talked to Bob. Bob's a great guy, by the way. I've been on an author streak here. I first talked to Bob. Then I talked to Rabbi Daniel Lapin. And then I got to talk to the guy who inspired the whole deal, which is Dan Miller. 48 Days to the Work You Love.
Yeah, not familiar, but go ahead.
Yeah, great book. And there's one uniting thread here. They're all friends of Dave Ramsey. So it's been a business person, and Bob did a really good job of explaining the Go-Giver you can tell it's his passion. He's really excited about it. He runs the Go Giver Facebook group and page, and that's his thing, which I really like. But with you, I want to go a little bit different direction. There's a lot of people that write books. Dave Ramsey
Yes.
wrote books. A lot of people write books, but there's not a lot of authors who write books as a living. You know what I mean by that? You know what I mean by the differentiation?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know a balloon guy who writes a couple of books ever so often just to help increase his balloon sales. So,
yes.
but you're like a writing book guy. You even wrote a little book, which I downloaded. I haven't got a chance to sit down and read it yet. What is that on your website now? The How to Write Gooder?
How to write good, or at least gooder. Yeah.
Yes. So that intrigues me because I think having a career, bootstrapping, starting up, being an entrepreneur doesn't necessarily mean you have to go out and start up a balloon business like I did. You can start writing a book in your spare time. Ever hear of a guy named Frank E. Peretti, the author?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
He wrote his first book, This Present Darkness, while he was waxing skis and filling in holes at a ski shop up in Washington, fixing
Mm-hmm.
skis. And then after it got published and it got a little bit of notice, all of a sudden he got a call from the publisher and said, by the way, how much do you need to write us a sequel and just live and do nothing but write that sequel? And you're like, what? And they just paid him a huge advance on that book, which obviously was a smart move on their part. And he went from being a part-time author and a full-time ski fixer
Mm-hmm.
to an author who has wrote many, many books from then on out. And I've read a lot of them. And he's just an amazing author, especially in that genre. I really like him.
Yeah.
So how did you get started? How's that for a first question? How did you first get started into writing? Was it in high school? Was it a kid? Was it later on?
You know, writing was always around me. My parents were both teachers. My dad was a music professor and a conductor. But you know, he was an academic as well as a performing musician. So he was correcting grad papers, and there was a lot of literature around my house. My mom was a history teacher. She's a playwright. She wrote and produced original plays with her school kids. So there was always a lot of, you know, kind of different aspects of writing going on around my house. But I honestly never set out to become a writer. It wasn't like I said, I'm going to do this as a writer. I never went to school to be a writer. My career has kind of zigzagged like a slalom course, a whole variety of ways, often bewildering to my parents, sometimes bewildering to me. I started out as a classical musician, played the cello, composer. While I was still in school, in high school, some friends and I started our own high school because we had a burning interest in education, and the schools where we were enrolled at the time were pretty dull places. And we started that school, and it was quite successful. So I was kind of in education. From there, I got involved in nutrition and health, and everywhere I went, every sort of area I got involved in, I was always the guy who ended up editing the newsletter, or editing the poster, or editing the article for the magazine, or whatever it was. So I was doing I was doing a lot of editing, and eventually, I got involved in business as sales, and in that sphere, I helped found a couple of magazines, and was the editor. Did a lot of editing with the magazines. So for years, I edited other people's stuff, and you know, sometimes I even recommend that. People say, how do you get started? It's good training to be a writer. Obviously, you can go to school. There are all kinds of fantastic online courses. I have some I recommend. There are lots of ways to become a skill, to refine or hone the skill of writing. Editing other people's stuff is a great way to do it, because it's other people's stuff. You know, you don't have any emotional attachment to it because you didn't write it. So
Yeah,
you kind of get to practice the craft of making something better without the angst you suffer at, you know, deleting your own stuff and changing your own stuff.
don't
So I
want to
did
kill
that for
my
years.
baby.
Yeah, exactly. I did that for professionally for over a decade, and then kind of moved into, I was actually planning to be a screenwriter. That was my my big plan for myself. And you know how we sometimes have big plans for ourselves, but it doesn't work out that way. So for me, I was going to be an A-list screenwriter in Hollywood when my friend Bob Burg came along, and I like to say Bob Burg ruined my career, because Bob came along and said, I got this idea for a book, but I don't know how to write this kind of book. It's a story, and I'm not a story. I'm not a story guy. I'm not a narrative guy. I'm not a dialogue guy. I'm a how-to guy. So I want you to write the book with me, not edit my stuff. I want you to write it with me. So we shook hands on the deal. We made a 50-50 deal. We're going to write this book together. And he said, I'll tell you what, you do the writing, I'll do the marketing. That's an oversimplification, because he had a lot of story ideas as well, and I've done some marketing as well. But basically, my job was to write words. And that was my first major book. And it ruined my career as a screenwriter, thank heavens. And it launched my career as an author. And since then, I've published about 30 books. And the Go-Giver series, as you know, you've read the Go-Giver. There's also the Go-Giver Leader. There's the Go-Giver Influencer. And then there's the book Go-Giver Sell More, which isn't a parable. It's sort of a companion volume to the Go-Giver. And now, this is not out yet, but next spring, we're going to have the Go-Giver Marriage. My wife and I just finished writing that. In fact, we're just working on the last few pages now. So there's a whole series of Go-Giver books.
I'm really looking for that one. Yes.
It's another parable. It's all of these. I know you haven't yourself read the Go-Giver Leader and Go-Giver Influencer yet, but those two are also stories that take place in the same town where the Go-Giver, the Pindar's town there, where the Go-Giver takes place. So they all kind of form I think saga is probably too grandiose a word for little parables.
It's the Go-Giver universe, kind of like the MCU.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the Go-Giver universe. It's, like the Lord of the Rings universe or the Star Wars universe. It's the Go-Giver universe. And the Go-Giver Marriage.
Oh yeah, sorry.
The Go-Giver Marriage also takes place in that same universe. Some of the same characters come back, and there's some new ones. And so we're looking forward to that. You're going to say.
Just as an aside, you were talking about your dad grading grad papers and stuff, and we're talking about books and authors, and I'm just thankful for one guy who was grading papers for extra cash, a college professor. You'll probably figure out who this is. And he was a long day of grading papers just to make the extra cash he needed to support his family, and he came across a blank page. And so, do you know what he wrote on that great blank page?
I do not know.
In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit. And then he just dropped it from there, and he kept grading papers, and that's J.R.R. Tolkien. There you go. Started Lord of the Rings.
Funny how we got started. Yeah.
Just random blank paper in the grad thing. He's like, I'll just write a note.
But it was so obviously it was already like stirring back in his brain somewhere, and waiting for a crack in the wall to pop out.
You never know what's going to ruin your career.
I want to say to people that, by the way, I think that not everyone is destined to be a writer. Obviously, it's not. Everyone has their own gifts. Everyone has their own path. Everyone has their own. I have a friend who says everyone has many talents but one gift. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it may be. In any case, we all have different talents and different skills and different leanings. But I do think a lot of people have a hobbit in a hole in the ground somewhere in the back. They have ideas. They have memories, experiences, reflections, realizations, disappointments, painful, whatever. People have this bank of experience that is unique to them, that has never found a way to come out and find expression because they simply haven't taken the time or haven't believed that it was there. So I do think, a lot of us have a hobbit in the hole in the ground in the back of our minds waiting for a blank page. That's a great story. I'll use that story in the future.
Yeah, it is a great story. And I'm a bit of a Tolkien fan beyond, and Lewis.
I would never have guessed.
Beyond Lewis. Just the books, beyond the books. So I've read biographies and listened to a full college course on them. Yeah.
Good for you. Good for you.
And
they're magnificent.
Talk about writers. C.S. Lewis. Do you know how incredibly talented and smart he was?
Yeah, actually, I do. In fact, I've studied the man just as you have. Yeah.
Have you heard of the
Hero
planets?
of mine.
The planets?
Yeah.
And how he
Yeah.
mixed the planets into the Chronicles of Narnia? Each one represents a separate planet. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, actually, yes. It's amazing. There's so
And
much learning and depth in those books.
yeah, and he did one a year. That's incredible.
Yeah,
So,
I know.
So if you want to
It's
be
amazing.
an author, that's one thing. If you surround yourself with something you love, you can start doing that, because if you surround around yourself with a lot of authors, you can be a better author. You surround yourself around a lot of leaders, that's going to come up. And I was liking what you were saying about that whole thing. Have you seen the kids movie Ratatouille?
No, I haven't.
It's a Pixar Disney. It's one of my personal favorite ones. Not only do I have kids, but I'm a big kid. When my wife and I were first married, the first couple of years, our neighbors with kids would come and borrow our kids' collection because they didn't have any for their kids and we didn't have kids.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole thing of that one, it's the rat that cooks. And the beginning of it, the main chefs, small spoiler, he dies, but he inspires the rat to cook. He says, anyone can cook. And of course, the food critic says, not anyone can cook. And he was really harsh on it. But you watch the whole the story. The moral of the story is everyone can cook. But you don't know exactly where greatness will come as a cook. So anyone, you can get greatness from a rat cook, and of course the film, because I don't think a rat today would be a great cook. But point being was, you never know where that little germ, where that little hole in the ground of the Hobbit. Everyone can write a book. That balloon guy said, he says, write a book. It's great for marketing. It doesn't take much to write a small book. Then again, my mom just wrote a book, and her first try, it's being published. So, but she's also introduced me to Lord of the Rings, and she read a lot of C.S. Lewis and Frankie Peretti and stuff. So I wonder how that works. I actually got to be a beta reader. Do you ever use a beta reader group?
Yeah, I do sometimes, yes.
Yeah, so I got to be a beta reader on a little fantasy novel, and he picked me because I read Tolkien and Lewis and fantasy and sci-fi and all these books. He's like, yep, you're the type of guy I need. So, no, that's really cool how you got started. And why you got started? Was it like Frankie Peretti? I'm sure you didn't just stop and completely, and I'm going to write a book now and no income for now until we write this book and get it published. How'd you go from working with Bob and getting a book published to being an author who now has your full-time income as an author from your books, right? So
yes.
how'd you go from, because that's kind of the bootstrap thing. A lot of people start writing books in their spare time.
Gradually and stumblingly. And, you know, I say this in the book, How to Write Good, that writers by and large are entrepreneurs. Not everybody. I mean, if you're a staff writer for a magazine, then you're on a salary, and that's great. That's a salaried position. That's having a job. But for most writers, certainly for authors, you know, publishing books, for most people who are doing writing, certainly part-time, maintaining a blog or being a writer on other social media outlets, or writing is an entrepreneurial gig. Writing is one of those deals where you're making up the career as you go along. You don't have a steady salary. You don't have any financial guarantees. You don't have an infrastructure that supports you or that directs you. Man, you are doing it on your own. And so for me, you know, people hear New York Times best-selling author. The dude must be loaded, right? He must be rolling in it. It isn't that way, because you publish in my book, How to Write Good. I actually take one chapter and kind of lay out the economics of how it works. It's very difficult to make a living as a writer. It's certainly not impossible. It's doable, and not just by, you know, Stephen King and you know, best-selling James Patterson, and not just by household word writers, but yeah, you can make a living as a writer, but it's difficult. The reason it's difficult is that, first off, you're an entrepreneur. The fact that you write a book doesn't guarantee it'll get published. The fact that you publish a book doesn't guarantee there'll be much sales. And even when there are sales, it doesn't guarantee sales will rise to any major level. You know, you can sell 5,000 books, 10,000 books, 20,000 books. Congratulations, you've sold 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 books, but you still have bills to pay and groceries to buy, and that isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people sort of have the assumption or the belief that if you get a publisher, like a mainstream publisher, that they will handle marketing the book. And it actually isn't that way. Publishers don't go sell books for you, particularly in nonfiction. But it's also, you know, it's true across the board, but particularly in nonfiction, memoir, how-to books, you know, books on specific topics that are not, you know, novels. Publishers get your book out. They will do some positioning. Maybe they'll place it in bookstores. Maybe they'll take out a few ads. They'll kind of set it up in the world. They'll create the channels, but they don't drive the sales. It's not what a publisher is set up to do. If you're an established best-selling author, then yes, the publisher will bring in whatever big guns they can to just move mountains and make it happen.
Yeah.
But that's because you already created the buzz. You have to create the buzz. You have to create the readership. You have to create the market. So you asked, how did it go for me? I said, stumblingly. It went very gradually. And honestly, so I've been writing books now. I've been publishing books for only about 12, 13 years. 2008 was The Go-Giver. I published a book in 2007. So Go-Giver was my second book. For most of those years, writing hasn't supported me, not entirely. You know, it's steadily coming along, but I have written books, for example, where typically a publisher will give you an advance. You write a book, give it to a publisher gives you an advance, which may be anywhere from, you know, $5,000 or $10,000 to six figures. It depends, but typically it's not that big. And when they give you an advance, it's typically broken into 4 pieces, paid out over time. Some of that advance you may actually receive after the book is published. It's like, I don't know how that's called an advance, but it is. So even if let's say you get $100,000 advance, it doesn't mean they give you a check for $100,000. In my case, all my books are partnerships, so I get 50% of the money. So take 100,000, peel off 15% for your agent, which you want, split the rest in half, then divide that into 4 pieces because they dole it out in four installments. And all of a sudden, you're not getting $100,000, you're getting $10,000. And if you want to try to live the whole year on $10,000, then you're not living in the world that I live in.
And that's also after Uncle Sam takes a bite.
That is true. That is absolutely true. So the bottom line is, it's been a slow and financially difficult climb for me. It's good. It's a good life. It supports me now, and I'm really, really happy with it. But it is far from automatic. It takes like any entrepreneurial adventure. It takes a lot of consistent discipline, and you absolutely have to have a passion and love for what you're doing, or you'll get discouraged way too soon.
And there's a dirty word in there.
Yeah.
Discipline. Very dirty word.
You know, it's a funny thing about discipline. I grew up playing the cello. That was my first real career. And before it was a career, obviously, I spent many, many years learning how to play the cello as a kid. I would play for hours a day. I was never that disciplined. Like you'll see a movie about a prodigy pianist or violinist or whatever. And typically in those movies, you'll see, the slave driving parent and the kid laboring for hours practicing scales till his fingers bleed, right? Yeah, you got it. If you have to drive yourself, that's a tough life. I've never had to drive myself because I love what I'm doing. I love the cello. I love the music. So my discipline means, I'll tell you what my discipline means for me. When I was a teenager, I used to go to parties with my friends. And in the kinds of parties I went to in those junior high years, invariably we'd party on till midnight and 1 and 2 and 3 o'clock. And into the wee hours of the morning, everybody would start getting horizontal. And so you have people on couches and people on mattresses and people just all kind of zoned out, sleeping, whatever. And room would be a mess. For whatever reason, I don't know, Isaiah. I was always the kid who at 3 or 4 in the morning was walking around with a trash bag, picking up paper cups and throwing paper plates and getting trash and kind of cleaning up the place just because that seemed like the thing to do. Somebody the other day asked me about the inspiration part of writing. Inspiration is really, really important. But the part that most people don't see or don't imagine is sort of the engineering side. The side what comes after the inspiration, the cleaning it up. Now that I've written this idea for a book, is taking it and revising it and revising it and revising it. A lot of my book, How to Write Good, is about how to take a piece of writing you've done and make it better and better and better and better. 90% of what I do is kind of, you might almost use the word menial. It's pushing letters around. It's not sparks of inspiration. They're in there, and I fall in love with each book and each character. But that is the dirty word, man. You're absolutely right. The discipline of it. You have to love what you're doing. I think you have to love what you're doing enough that the discipline doesn't become painful. That the discipline becomes a necessary and appreciated part of the joy of creation.
Yeah, and that fits
business, same thing. Entrepreneurs, right?
And it fits right.
Every entrepreneur has bookkeeping.
Oh, of course. It's like I think you would like that book, The 48 Days, and I'll send you the link to the interview I did with Dan Miller. Sure. Because there's also Donald Miller who writes The Story Brand, and Dan and Donald, and I always flip them in my head sometimes. But
by the way, I've read a lot of Frank Peretti.
Yeah.
Piercing the Darkness. This thing of awesome.
My most recent favorite is Illusion. And he does some research. He does some in-depth research, especially when he writes about something I happen to know something about. Then he writes it. Illusion, he's talking about a magician and the whole world of magic and magicians. And I know enough about magic. I'm a clown. I'm part of a Christian magicians thing, so I know a bit about magic and the terminology and stuff. And he's nailing the terminology. He knows exactly the right words in the right spot in the right way. And that's a lot of work. It's important. When you're writing about
I've written a lot. I've written a lot of books about military topics.
Oh yeah.
And when you're writing about military, man, you got to get it right. You got to get the calibers right. You got to get the rank right. You got to get the form of address to your superiors and inferior. You got to get all that right, because if you don't, your military readership will see one thing on a place and they'll go, this is bull. I'm not, and that's it, man. So the same thing is true if you're writing about forensics. Or if you're right. And can you blame them in a way, because the whole thing of a story is, you need to have this willing suspension of belief.
Yeah, exactly.
It needs to feel real for every second. If you let the illusion, speaking of illusion, if you let it drop for even a moment, then the story kind of falls apart. It's like having a character in a movie suddenly looking at the camera, So can you blame them, the correctors? And whether you're writing about, even in a parable, like I wrote a book called The Recipe a couple of years ago with a friend who was the Bob Burg of that book. His name is Charles Carroll. He's a chef. He's a world-class Olympian chef. And the book is about a young kid who's lost his dad, who is angry at the world, is going down a troubled path, and he crosses paths with a crusty old diner chef. It's kind of like Master Chef meets Karate Kid, he starts learning lessons from this old chef, and they come to a crisis point and so forth. But a lot of it took place in a diner kitchen. I had to get the food right.
Oh yes.
I had to get the pots and pans and knives. I had to get it all right. Like I had to learn enough about what it is to be a diner cook so that people who spend their lives in that world could read that book and never feel like, oh, this is wrong. It's really important. It's like respecting your reader is really, really important.
And I can tell the difference. I saw one where anyone can publish. It's just an app that you can read. And I read through the story. It was intriguing enough to begin with. Yeah. But then it just went on. And then it was about rich people and snooty family inherited wealth, rich people. Okay, I get that. common target. But then he started talking about how they all had these huge lines of credit, and he was only using all his credit card. I'm like, no, no, no. Most rich people have cash. They don't need a credit line.
Yeah, anybody can write. Also, anybody can do surgery, but is that who you want for your doctor?
Exactly. And by the way, you know where I got the correctors from? Mike
No.
Rowe. Do you know who that is, Mike Rowe?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you listen to his podcast and he's added a new segment where they talk about the podcast we just listened to, what inspired it, what came up, all these different things. It's really interesting. And they're always talking about the correctors because if you've ever heard his podcast, it's called The Way I Heard It. And it's an homage to the rest of the story.
Right.
And so he purposely says the way I heard it, just in case he gets something wrong. He goes, well, that's actually just the way I heard it. So maybe I heard it wrong type of thing.
Yeah.
But he talks about the correctors. You get one thing wrong in that, and they'll be like, no, it was this and this and this. And he goes, okay, well, you know.
Yeah.
So now what did you do up until you were able to live off of writing? What was your ski shop?
I'd been involved in business and sales, and my wife and I both had consulted to companies. So we'd do some consulting. And for a while, you know, I mentioned that people who are, say, staff writers for a magazine have a salary. That was me for a while. For many years while I was editing, I took a small salary from one of those magazines that I helped found as senior editor. So I supplemented my income for many years, either through or both through sales consulting, sales related jobs, not salary jobs, but contract work, piecemeal work, and a salary, part-time salary as an editor. And I think, you know, famously, a lot of writers, novelists, you know, are famous for their day job being that they're an English teacher. Stephen King was an English teacher for years. Yeah. There's a wonderful author, and I'm a big fan of in the U.S., Chris Knopf, who's written a great crime series that I really appreciate. And his professional career is he's got a marketing company. James Patterson, one of the best-selling authors on the planet. Now he spent a whole career in a marketing firm, advertising marketing firm. So a lot of writers, you know, interesting. Here's an interesting example of somebody who would answer your question in the most fascinating way. Adrian Mckinty, who wrote a book, his breakout book, which I think came out 2 years ago, and it was one of the it books of the year. Everybody was talking about it. A book called The Chain. The story of The Chain was simple. It was like a chain letter. You get a phone call. Your daughter's been kidnapped, and you'll see her again when you go kidnap somebody else's daughter, and the chain goes on. If you break the chain, you never see your kid again. Terrifying, horrifying. You know, Don Winslow called it Jaws for parents. So it was it was a huge phenomenon. But here's the thing: Mckinty had been writing great books for years. He'd won awards for his books. He just wasn't selling a lot of copies. Couldn't live off it. So the story goes, and he was from Ireland, and he was living in the States. He'd moved down to Australia for a while. At this point in his life, he was driving an Uber to make ends meet for his family, and finally wrote one night on his blog, "I'm throwing in the towel. You know, this writer thing is not working for me." And Don Winslow, a very famous established novelist, read this and said, "This guy's too talented. We can't let him go," and persuaded his agent to call up Mckinty and say, "You know, you got to write us a book that we can publish in the States." Anyway, he was on the verge of quitting because he couldn't get his writing to support him. And he's a phenomenal author. So, you know, it just highlights the fact that writers are entrepreneurs. And most successful novelists, certainly short story writers, which is even tougher hill to climb, make their income somewhere else until that point where they break through, you know, deep enough to support themselves.
I mean, I even started this podcast, starting writing a blog, and when the podcast started taking off, the blog kind of went to the wayside because it is hard.
Yeah.
And when I write the blog, I look at it kind of like, who was it, Michelangelo had said the statue's in there, I just have to cut away the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Writing is a lot like that.
Yeah, yeah.
You just
Yes, it
spit out
is.
your first draft and you throw everything on that page, and like, that's
Yeah,
really too long and that doesn't sound good. Let's go and
yeah,
cut this word out. Oh, this is great here, not great there. Let's switch those.
yeah,
I just with 2 kids running around the house and having to sell balloons and everything else, it just was getting
yeah,
too slow to do a blog because
yeah.
the one thing I think you can probably help me with this. This is just an idea I just had. The shorter amount you write, the more you have to write to keep it up.
Mm.
So like a blog, you have to keep it up on a fairly consistent basis. And even now, you can't just stop and just collect royalties the rest of your life. Eventually, you're going to have to write something new to get people going again. I'm
Yeah.
thinking
I
you
think it
have to
applies
keep
to,
up on it to some degree. You can't just stop.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it applies pretty much to any form of writing, unless you're Harper Lee and you wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah.
Yeah. And you never know. It's like, of course, I'm guessing, have you read Jim Collins' Good to Great?
Yeah. Jim Collins. Yeah.
Yeah. The whole idea of the sudden overnight success taking 15 years before that.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
so typical of all entrepreneurs writing same thing.
Yes.
You write again and again and again. And matter of fact, the guy I did the beta reading for, he said he wrote several novels and then he went through them and said, these are crap. He himself. So he put that
Mm-hmm.
aside, tried again, put that aside and tried again until it came up to his standards that matched his type of novel that he liked. And
Mm-hmm.
then he published that one. And it's done fairly well. Of course, he has a big YouTube channel and he's got a large fan base there, which went immediately over and bought the book and spread the word really quick. And it promotes it on his channel, which is good. But it wasn't a sudden overnight success. He wrote 2 or 3 crap novels that he said they're just awful. These are horrible. And I was writing more and everything else. But it's never a sudden overnight success. It's like a lotto millionaire. If you're an overnight success, you're usually an overnight failure too, right behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So now, what would you say? I have a friend. I won't say his name, but if he listens to this, he'll know what I'm talking about. He's working as a corrections officer at a correctional facility, but he also likes to write, and he's always written. He's always been wanting to write and stuff. And he kind of, I don't know if he's given up on it, but he does write. So what would you say to a guy who's just working the everyday job and just writing in his spare time? I personally don't think he should give up, but what would you say to encourage that guy?
Well, it depends on what he wants to do. I mean, I don't know the guy what
Yeah.
his goals are for writing, but if he aspires to be a published novelist, or if he aspires to be a columnist, or I don't know what he wants, but one thing is for sure, if you want to go anywhere with your writing, first off, you got to do it every day. You got to write every day. It doesn't have to be hours, obviously, but it has to be some time every day. You got to be writing, at least a half hour a day, hopefully more than a half hour, hopefully an hour or 2 hours a day. And the other thing is you have to have a commitment to not just writing, but writing and then improving your writing, making the writing better. My definition of a writer is not necessarily someone who's published or who earns an income in their writing. It's somebody who writes every day and has a commitment to making their writing better and works at that in earnest every day. So, one thing that's ancillary to that is to share the writing. I mean, you could write in your room and nobody reads it for years and get better, but it's much easier, or anyway, it's more accelerated. It's assisted by sharing your writing. That's one thing a blog is great for. Social media can be helpful for that. And I think short form writing, columns in newspapers, editorials in newspapers, newsletters, your own newsletter, a blog is almost like a newsletter. Short form publishing, and by publishing, I simply mean putting a finished piece of writing, and the word finished is important, a finished piece of writing out there so that other people read it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's publishing. Even if you write a newsletter and share it with 5 people. You know, Stephen King talks about the first newsletter he wrote in school, which was shared. Well, I guess it was shared with his classmates and the whole school. So maybe it was a few hundred people. But even if it was only a dozen people, it's a form of publishing. I spent a lot of years writing as I said, I was editing magazines, but I was also writing columns for those. Some of them were monthly, some were bi-monthly. The schedule varied, but they were all regular. And my columns were maybe a page or half a page. So it was a very compact form of writing consistently. For many years, I wrote a blog every week. Concise, compact, consistent, regular. Right now, my blog, I'm writing every 2 weeks. I can't do more than every 2 weeks, but every 2 weeks is, you know, you use the word discipline again, right? So it's a discipline. But the beauty of it is when you know somebody's going to read it, it's going to get published. You know, it's kind of like, you know, someone's coming over, so you clean your house up a little bit. You know, you make sure that your floor is swept. Or if you know you're going to be on a podcast, you ideally want to have a shirt where the buttons are working. You know, I'm not coming out in my pajamas for a podcast. Although these days coming out in your pajamas for a podcast is okay. But
I even brush my teeth before a podcast just to make sure I don't have anything in my teeth.
Good man. Exactly. You got to do it. So my point is, your corrections officer friend, find some short form of publishing where people will read your stuff regularly. When you know you're going to publish, you have an incentive to finish the piece as finished as you can make it. And that's important because that's the only way you really get better. If you take the same little novel you're doing or the same short story you're working on or the same screenplay you're working on, and you poke at it for years and you're just improving it and improving it and improving it, you're just slapping yourself in the face. It's not going in, you're going in circles. So you really gotta find an audience, write for that audience, publish finished pieces, and then, you know, just know what's your trajectory, what is your aim. I've always, you know, my aim as a writer since I started was always to publish books that would reach millions of people. I never knew I was going to be a novelist. My first novel's about to come out, and that was as much of a surprise to me as it was to anybody. But yeah, I've always been going in this direction. So yeah, you got to write every day and write with a purpose in mind and share it with the world, at least a small piece of the world.
And because you never know what can happen, because I'm drawing a complete blank which way it was. I can't remember if it was Lewis that encouraged Tolkien and Tolkien that encouraged Lewis. I think it was Lewis that encouraged Tolkien to publish. Was it Lewis that encouraged Tolkien?
I don't know. I don't know myself.
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Doesn't matter.
One of them
doesn't matter.
The whole little what's the name of their little group? You know what I'm talking about. Him and Lewis and a couple other guys that were writers. They all sat down at the Bird and the Baby, the pub. They would go sit down and share their stories. The Inklings. You know, the Inklings, they sat down, they shared their stories, and they talked about what they were writing, and they shared their finished little pieces and poems and such. And that's where we got a lot of these great novels and ideas that came from. The whole space trilogy, C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, came from that because Tolkien challenged him to write a space trilogy, and then he was going to write one, and then he never did.
I love it. Yeah.
But the whole idea of the authors getting together and at least showing each other, so they were getting better at writing because they were sharing what they were writing. What do you think of this? Oh, that's junk. Sometimes it backfired. Sometimes they're just like, oh, you just don't get it, which that might happen. People just won't get what you're writing. It's life.
Yes.
I can't remember who it was. One of the guys, when Tolkien started talking about it, he goes, what, hobbits and elves again? He's like, well, just be quiet now. So sometimes, but that's another thing. How do you deal with criticism? Because you know it's going to come. Not just correctors, but critics.
Depends. Depends if I place value in the critique or not. And again, not to sound the same tune again, but in the book, How to Write Good, I devoted a section to critique, because critique is, you know, my writing skill or ability hasn't improved in a straight line through my career. It's mostly been like, oop, oop. It's kind of gone along, and then I've had little blips where I significantly got better. And those blips have always been times when I had a great editor and or great critique from somebody else. You mentioned beta readers. I have a few beta readers I go to. For the novel, I actually hired a consultant, a story consultant, to read my draft and give me critique. She was professional, you know, at doing that. Critique is essential, but it's got to be from people whose critique you have reason to value. Just because you have a friend who's willing to read your writing doesn't mean their critique is going to be valuable. Most cases, it won't be. And in many cases, it can even be destructive. And not necessarily because they tear you down and say it's awful. It can be destructive because it's not useful. You can have friends who think everything you do is amazing. You know, like your mom can think everything you do is amazing. That can be destructive, actually, because it's not useful. It doesn't make you better. I have a circle of readers. Many of them, they'll read a draft of a book, and you know, mostly what they have to do is they tell me which things they loved.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I love that. I appreciate that. You know, when you write something, it's like a newborn baby. It's very fragile. Your ego is in it. And so it's nice to hear, I love this part. Somebody will say, I love this part. And I go, oh yeah, I did too. I'm so glad somebody else loves it. But it's not useful to me as a writer. It's nice for me as an ego, as a person. What's useful to me is when someone says, the whole thing held together really well, except in this part, I felt like I lost the thread. I wasn't sure where it was going at that point, or this part didn't feel believable, or at this point, the dialogue lost me.
Yeah, or there was a little bit too much exposition.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I want people
too much.
I want people to tell me for them, what works and doesn't work, and I need them to be knowledgeable enough as readers for the critique to have chances are better than 50% that it's valid. You have to know when you get critique from somebody that even from the best critiquer, I use the word critiquer rather than critic, because critic is a loaded term. But anyway, even from the most knowledgeable professional critique, you have to know that there will be things you want to take with a grain of salt. You know, you don't necessarily change everything someone says you should change or make every correction. I think it was Neil Gaiman who said this thing that I love, which is when people tell you, and I wouldn't say people, I would say, you know, qualified readers. When people tell you something doesn't work, they're nearly always right. When people tell you how to fix it, they're nearly always wrong. Most times I don't need my readers to tell me what to do to make this thing that didn't work, to make it better. That's my job. I'll figure that out as a writer.
Yeah.
And most times if they do tell me what to do, it's actually not an answer. I had an editor in my very first book, my first experience with a professional editor, who went through the book, and she would make suggestions about what needed to happen here. And then she would write, she would say, like, for example, and she would write a paragraph. And Isaiah, her writing was so awful. I mean, it was so awful. It would make me, I would show my wife and say, can you believe this? I was young. I was a little cocky. I mean, I wasn't that young. I was in my 50s, 40s. Anyway, I wasn't that young, but I was young as a writer. I got a little cocky, and I was thinking, because the writing was so awful, I just discounted it. But within a few weeks, I would go over it, and I realized her editing is brilliant. Her critique is spot on. All the stuff that she said I should change, she's right. She's right. Her suggestions for how to do it were terrible. She's not a writer, but she's a great editor. So that's what I want. I want someone who has a really fine eye and can say, I see what you're doing, and I see where it works, and here's where I think it got off the rails. And then they leave it to me to fix it. So it's so valuable.
I think it's probably the heart of the person too, because there's a big difference between someone who's trying to be constructive and help you build something, rather than someone that just wants to tear it all down and burn it down because they have fun with it.
Or prove how much they know.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, reminds me of Rhinoceros Success, another one of Dave's must reads. And he talks about, if a cow criticizes you, ignore him. But if a lion criticizes you, you got to pay attention, because it's got to be the right person, the right attitude. Another rhino warns you, then you really listen, kind of thing. And I'm trying to track him down and get him on too, Scott Alexander. That would probably be a fun one. So we've been going for nearly 45 minutes or so, an hour almost now. It's been really fun. And I could keep going all night, but I'm sure my wife's going to be soon calling me in. Are you done yet? Are you coming home? I need help with the kids.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you probably have kids, right?
Grown.
I meant grown kids, yeah. But you remember those days of,
I do.
Bedtime and
the
most wonderful, perfect kids in the world until bedtime, and it's like Jekyll and Hyde, and good luck. So
that's right.
Anyway, I'll let you go. Thank you so much. And before we sign off here, any last words for entrepreneurs, inspiring writers in all fields of writing, be it bloggers, other types of content creators? Any last little things of wisdom that you've learned through making bad decisions to get the experience to make good decisions?
Sure. I think what I would say would apply equally to writers and to entrepreneurs, because they're both, in both cases, you're creating something. You're creating something that didn't exist before, whether it's a story out of words or it's a business out of products, services, commerce, what have you, human interactions. And there's kind of two aspects to that. I talk a lot about rewriting. I talk about a lot about revising. In the case of a business enterprise, that's correction, changing your strategy, changing whatever it is that isn't working, because you're constantly revising and rewriting your business. Just the same way you're constantly revising and rewriting your story. I think it's not only helpful but necessary to have a highly developed faculty of self-critique. Be on the lookout of what needs to change, how you can get it better, how you can make it better, how you can make it better. But what a lot of writers, anyhow, aspiring writers do is they strangle themselves before they even get out the door by criticizing the writing while they're writing it. Writing a paragraph and looking at it and saying, "Oh, that's terrible." Writing your friend who wrote 3 novels and said they were great. I admire that. But a lot of people try to write and cut themselves off at their knees because they start criticizing. The critical inner voice starts jabbering at them while they're still just getting out of the gate. So what I would say is it takes a tremendous amount of faith in yourself, faith in your idea, faith that you had a good idea, that you have a good idea, that there's good stuff in there that merits getting onto the page, or that your business, there's a good idea that merits, forming a business. It may take a lot of mistakes and revision and failure, and to find it. But Stephen King was, people have probably read the story. It's in his book On Writing. But as a young and barely published writer of short fiction in men's magazines, he hadn't had any breakout success yet. He wrote a story about a teenage girl, and he'd written a few pages of it, maybe, 10, 12 pages, and he thought it was crap, and he threw it in the trash, literally. And his wife, Tabitha, who was going through cleaning, straightening out, brushed the ashes off it and took it out, uncrumpled the pages, and took it to him and said, "This is good, you should finish it." And he said, "I don't know anything about teenage girls. It's just like, I don't think I can do this." And she said, "Well, I'll help you with the teenage girls part. You should keep writing it." So he did. And that was Carrie. And, he eventually sold the paperback rights for like $800,000 or something. And it was his breakout moment.
Hmm.
But it started out in failure. And a
Hmm.
lot of writing, a lot of successful writing starts out in failure. In How to Write Good, my book, I take a whole chapter showing you the first page of The Go-Giver in its original draft. And it's
Hmm.
not very good. And you can read it yourself and you can judge it. It's not very good. And then I show you the first page in the published version and all the steps that we took to get from here to there. So I think it's important to know that there are jewels in the mud. There are good ideas in the mess, that it is a mess. Your first attempts will not be masterpieces, but that there will be germs of seeds of greatness in there. And it just takes love, faith, and discipline to find them. So those are my thoughts. It's been lovely speaking with you.
Thank you so much for coming on. If you found value in this content, please leave a comment and give us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you use. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. If you would like to support us, you can check out our sponsor links, or if you would like to directly support the show, you can donate or join our membership program at buymeacoffee.com/bootstrap. Of course, it really helps when you share these podcasts as well. If you would like to interact with me and other bootstrappers and leaders, you can join our O'Connor Bootstrap Podcast Facebook group. You have been listening to the O'Connor Bootstrap Podcast and Athos Business Solutions Podcast. For our companion podcast, the Athos Business Podcast, hosted by Jason St. Clair, past episodes, and related blogs, check out our website at www.athos.com, which is www.atheoz.com, or theoz.com. Until next time, I've been your friendly neighborhood entrepreneur, Isaiah O'Connor.